Before dawn, explosions and fires were reported far from the front lines in Russia's energy belt. Ukraine's military and its security service say they struck multiple oil and gas sites, arguing the goal is not symbolism, but money, to squeeze the revenues Moscow uses to wage war. Russia says its air defenses intercept many attacks, but regional officials in the south confirmed at least one fire at a port fuel facility. In a conflict now stretching toward a fourth year, the battlefield is widening into refineries, storage tanks, and the supply chain that keeps armies moving. Tonight, the economic war intensifies. According to an SBU official, Ukrainian long-range drones hit oil product tanks at the Russian port of Temryuk in the Krasnodar region and also struck a gas processing plant in Orenburg, deep in southwestern Russia. The security service said these operations are part of a systematic campaign against the oil and gas sector. The stated purpose, the SBU source said, is to reduce Russia's budget income, limit foreign currency earnings, and complicate logistics, including fuel supplies for Russian forces. Independent verification of all claimed hits remains difficult during wartime. Moscow has not confirmed damage at every site mentioned by Ukrainian officials. Ukraine's general staff, in a separate statement, said its air force used British Storm Shadow cruise missiles to strike the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery in Russia's Rostov region. The general staff said multiple explosions were recorded and that the target was hit. It described the refinery as a major supplier of oil products in southern Russia and said it provides diesel and jet fuel to Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. Russia has not offered detailed public assessments of the reported damage, and Reuters and other outlets note they cannot independently confirm battlefield claims in real time. Still, the reports shape perceptions. On the Temryuk strike, Russian regional authorities in Krasnodar acknowledged a drone attack and said 2 oil product tanks caught fire at the port. They reported flames covering about 2,000 square meters as emergency crews worked to contain the blaze. Temryuk sits on the route of energy shipments moving through the Sea of Azov area, and damage there can disrupt storage and loading operations even when production elsewhere continues. Ukrainian officials, for their part, frame port and depot targets as logistics nodes that translate directly into fuel availability at the front. The immediate economic impact is still unclear for now. The other location highlighted by the SBU, Orenburg, is far from the usual battle maps. Ukrainian officials say the gas processing plant there is about 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine's border, underscoring how far Kyiv's long-range drones can reach. Reuters described the Orenburg facility as the largest of its kind in the world, a complex tied into Russia's broader gas industry. Strikes on such plants can matter in several ways: by forcing shutdowns for safety checks, by damaging specialized equipment that is slow to replace, and by signaling that distance alone no longer guarantees protection. Russian officials have not detailed impacts. Alongside the energy targets, Ukraine's general staff said Ukrainian troops also hit a military airfield in the Russian city of Maikop in the Republic of Adygea in the North Caucasus region. It offered few details beyond saying the strike occurred and that the level of damage was being assessed. Claims like these are often difficult to check independently, especially when authorities restrict information during emergencies. But taken together with the refinery and port strikes, they reflect a broader Ukrainian approach, hitting not only battlefield positions, but the infrastructure that sustains operations from fuel supplies to bases and runways across Russia. These reported strikes come as the war approaches its 4-year mark and diplomatic efforts have yet to produce a durable breakthrough. In recent months, both sides have expanded the fight over energy, trading attacks that aim to weaken the other's ability to keep fighting. Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukraine's power generation and transmission, while Ukraine has focused more on Russia's oil and gas value chain. Each side frames its actions as necessary, and each accuses the other of endangering civilians. The result is a conflict where the lights, the heat, and the fuel supply become weapons, not just resources now. For Ukraine, the logic is blunt. Russia's state budget is heavily supported by oil and gas income, and energy exports remain a major source of currency despite sanctions. Ukrainian officials argue that every refinery shutdown, every damaged tank farm, and every disrupted terminal reduces the money available for missiles, drones, and artillery. Critics counter that energy infrastructure is intertwined with civilian life, and that strikes can raise risks for workers and nearby communities. This debate sits at the center of the campaign. In the latest statements, the SBU linked the strikes to Russia's finances. The service said the aim is to cut budget revenues, choke off foreign currency earnings, and make it harder for Russia to run the logistics that keep its forces supplied. That is a different pitch than early war strikes framed mainly as retaliation. It is also designed for an international audience. Kyiv has urged partners to tighten sanctions and enforcement against Russian energy exports, arguing that the war is being underwritten by oil and gas. The message now is that Ukraine is trying to apply pressure itself from the air. Reuters tracking, based on open source data and reporting, has shown a rise in the tempo of Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy facilities since early August. In that period, Ukraine has been reported to have launched dozens of attacks on refineries, pumping stations, storage depots, and export terminals, reaching targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russia. The surge contrasts with the earlier summer, when far fewer such strikes were recorded. Ukrainian sources have described the campaign's primary goal as creating shortages of key fuels inside Russia and forcing the Kremlin to spend more on air defense for sites far from the battlefield. How are these sites being reached? Analysts say modern long-range drone raids are often built around numbers, not single weapons. Waves of unmanned aircraft probing air defenses, some designed to draw fire, others intended to reach the target. A Reuters source familiar with Ukraine's long-range campaign said typical operations can involve a few dozen drones, though larger salvos have been discussed publicly by Ukrainian leaders. Russia, meanwhile, has adapted, boosting interception rates and hardening key facilities with additional defenses. This back and forth is turning industrial geography into a new front line, where pipes and tanks are treated like battleground terrain itself. The campaign has had measurable effects. Reuters calculations suggested drone strikes temporarily knocked out around a fifth of Russia's refining capacity, as units were taken offline after hits or fired. Russian gasoline prices have risen, and sporadic queues have been reported at filling stations, though prices and availability can swing for many reasons, including seasonal demand and state controls. Some analysts also note a paradox. When refineries slow down, more crude can be diverted to export, which can help maintain government income even as refined products tighten at home. That tension is part of what Kyiv is trying to exploit. Beyond the battlefield, investors watch these strikes for what they might mean to energy markets. Russia is a major oil exporter, and even partial outages at refineries or terminals can nudge product balances, affect freight routes, and raise uncertainty for traders. At the same time, global crude prices are driven by many forces: OPEC policy, demand growth, inventories, and geopolitical risk across multiple regions. So one fire by itself rarely moves the market for long. The larger impact may be on refined products and shipping costs, especially if repeated attacks force rerouting, repairs, and security around ports and storage hubs. Ukraine's campaign has also widened beyond land targets. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for drone attacks on a Russian oil rig in the Caspian Sea, and for strikes on Russian-linked tankers described as part of a shadow fleet used to move oil under sanctions. Reuters has reported it could not independently verify some claims, and companies have not always commented. Still, the pattern is clear. Kyiv is pushing the fight toward the export system itself, trying to raise the costs and risks of moving Russian oil by sea. That introduces fresh questions about escalation, maritime security, and environmental risk going forward. Some Ukrainian officials and supporters have described these attacks as a form of kinetic sanctions. Pressure applied not through paperwork and enforcement, but through physical disruption. The idea is to impose costs that sanctions alone have not fully delivered, especially when oil finds ways to flow through intermediaries. But there is a trade-off. Energy markets are global, and any sustained disruption can spill over onto countries not party to the war, raising prices or straining supply. That is one reason many governments tread carefully in their reactions, even while condemning Russia's invasion and backing Ukraine's right to self-defense in principle. The Orenburg site also shows how connected energy systems can be. Earlier this year, a drone attack on the Orenburg gas processing plant was reported to have forced a suspension of gas intake from Kazakhstan, according to Kazakhstan's energy ministry and local Russian officials at the time. When major processing nodes are disrupted, effects can ripple into contracts, pipeline flows, and industrial supply chains beyond the target area. That matters for governments trying to keep prices stable and for businesses planning demand. It also raises diplomatic sensitivities because neighbors can feel impacts from a strike they had no role in. This is not happening in a vacuum. Russia has repeatedly struck Ukraine's electricity system and district heating. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, the International Energy Agency has documented extensive damage to generation and grids and says the power industry has suffered the greatest losses within Ukraine's energy sector. So that shapes Kyiv's willingness to target Russian energy assets. Ukraine argues it is responding to an energy war already being waged against its cities. For civilians, the stakes are immediate. In winter, a damaged substation is not abstract. It can mean hours without light, heat, or water, and sometimes no communications. In the days leading into the latest Ukrainian claims, Ukraine has also faced waves of Russian strikes. In late November, President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia launched more than 650 drones and over 50 missiles in a single overnight attack that hit energy facilities and civilian areas. Ukraine says many projectiles were shot down, but that some strikes got through. Reports like that underline why energy has become central to the war narrative. It is both a military enabler and a direct pressure point on society. When power fails, factories slow, trains delay, hospitals switch to generators, and patience is tested. Energy sites sit in a gray zone in modern war. Refineries and gas plants serve civilian economies, but they can also supply military vehicles and fund defense spending. Humanitarian law requires distinction and proportionality, and both sides insist they strike legitimate targets. Outside observers often struggle to assess intent and effect, especially when information is limited and propaganda is intense. Fires at tank farms and terminals pose hazards for workers, residents, and the environment, even when the site is industrial. That is why many governments urge restraint and emphasize protecting civilians, while acknowledging Ukraine's right to resist invasion under fire. The mention of Storm Shadow missiles adds another layer. These British-made cruise missiles have been used by Ukraine in past strikes on targets. It says support Russia's war effort. Their use is politically sensitive because it highlights Western support and the conditions attached to it. Ukraine argues it must hit military and logistical sites beyond the front to defend itself, while Russia says Western-supplied weapons deepen foreign involvement. For allies, the calculus is constant. Help Ukraine resist and recover, but avoid steps that could widen the war. Each reported Storm Shadow strike brings that debate back at a tense moment. Russia has been trying to adapt. Reuters has cited satellite imagery showing protective structures and what appear to be anti-drone nets over parts of some refineries, alongside air defense coverage. Those measures can reduce the chance of a direct hit, but they also cost money and time. Ukraine faces its own constraint, producing enough long-range drones to sustain pressure as Russia improves interception. This is a contest of scale and innovation. When one side finds a vulnerability, the other tries to patch it, and the cycle repeats. In that sense, the energy war becomes an arms race in technology and capacity. Fuel is the backbone of any army. Tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles run on diesel. Aircraft need jet fuel. Generators power communications and air defense radars. If supplies are plentiful, commanders can plan offensives and rotations. If supplies are tight, every move becomes more complicated. That is why Ukraine repeatedly highlights refineries and depots as military relevant, even when they look like civilian infrastructure. The General Staff's description of the Novoshakhtinsk refinery as a supplier of diesel and jet fuel to Russian troops fits that argument. Russia does not discuss its military fuel logistics publicly, but the importance is hard to dispute. Cutting Russia's income is not straightforward. Reuters reporting has noted that much of Russia's federal oil and gas revenue is paid through taxes tied to extraction at the oil field, not only at the refinery gate. Refinery disruptions can shift flows rather than stop them, pushing more crude toward export while refined products tighten. To dent the state's bottom line, sustained damage would need to reduce production or constrain exports. That is a high bar for a country that can reroute cargoes and use state intervention. Kyiv's strategy appears to be cumulative. Repeated hits that raise costs, create bottlenecks, and force trade-offs. Ukraine's target list reflects export geography. Pumping stations and pipeline hubs are remote and defended, yet critical to moving oil from fields to refineries and ports. Reuters reporting has described strikes on pumping infrastructure linked to major routes, including stations on or near the Druzhba system. European purchases have fallen sharply since 2022, but pipelines still matter for regional supply and for Russia's ability to redirect flows. A damaged station can slow throughput and force shutdowns for repairs, creating delays across schedules and storage. For Kyiv, these are leverage points beyond the trench lines that still shape the war's economics. Europe is less exposed to Russian energy than before 2022, after a shift toward new gas supplies and more LNG. But volatility still travels, and Russia has redirected its oil trade toward Asia and new markets, often via longer routes and intermediaries. That means the effect of a strike can show up far away, in freight rates, insurance costs, and refinery margins. For consumers, those costs can filter into pump prices or heating bills, even if the damaged site is across a border. Energy is not just local, it is a global bloodstream, and disruptions can move fast at times. Ukraine is fighting this energy war while trying to keep its system alive. The International Energy Agency has estimated that damage to Ukraine's electric power industry since 2022 exceeds $11 billion, and that estimates for building back lost capacity are around $30 billion. The agency notes that recovery is not a simple return to the past, because Ukraine wants a resilient, decentralized grid. Those figures help explain why Kyiv frames strikes on Russian energy as pressure on the war's fund. Yet rebuilding cannot wait for peace because winters keep coming and the grid must carry the load daily again. Ukraine's hope is that sustained pressure on Russia's energy sector will change Moscow's calculations and, eventually, help bring talks close. Ukrainian officials argue sanctions have not fully curtailed oil earnings when enforcement is uneven, and buyers still purchase discounted crude. Physical disruption, they say, forces immediate choices. Spend more on air defense, redirect funds to repairs, and accept domestic shortages. Whether that pressure is enough is uncertain. Russia has shown resilience, and it can shift costs onto consumers or draw on reserves. But the campaign is designed to accumulate friction, not deliver a single knockout. It is attrition by disruption. Every strike carries the retaliation. Russia has answered Ukraine's long-range campaign with continuing attacks on Ukraine's electricity and gas infrastructure, keeping energy near the center of the war. Officials on both sides say they seek to limit harm to civilians, but fires and cascading failures are hard to control. A burning tank can threaten adjacent equipment. A damaged processing unit can force shutdowns that ripple through networks. Air defense interceptions can also scatter debris onto streets and homes. That is why each new wave of strikes revives calls to protect infrastructure and to pursue a ceasefire that can hold. So what is confirmed and what remains murky? Ukraine's military and security agencies have claimed strikes on the Novoshakhtinsk refinery, the Temryuk port tanks, and the Orenburg gas processing plant. Russian authorities in Krasnodar have confirmed a fire at Temryuk and said 2 tanks burned over a large area. Beyond that, details are limited. Kyiv says multiple explosions were recorded at the refinery. Russia has not released comparable accounts. For Orenburg, Ukraine says the plant was hit. Russian detail has been sparse. In modern war, early facts are contested, and the picture sharpens only over days through imagery and reporting. Energy attacks are also information attacks. A refinery fire is a powerful image, and videos spread quickly across social media, sometimes without clear dates or locations. Officials can use those images to signal strength or shape public mood. For viewers, the challenge is verification. Satellite imagery, emergency service statements, and geolocation can help, but they rarely arrive instantly. In the meantime, uncertainty becomes part of the story. A claimed hit might mean anything from minor damage to a shutdown. A claimed interception can still leave debris and fires. Often the real impact shows up later, in production figures and repair timetables. For people living near these sites, the story is less strategic and more immediate. Workers and firefighters face the heat and smoke when a strike triggers a blaze. Authorities focus on containment, evacuations, and preventing spills into waterways. Even without injuries, incidents disrupt life and strain local services. In Russia's south, where ports and depots sit close to towns and transport corridors, a fire can mean closures and shipments interrupted. The same is true in Ukraine, where energy crews repair lines under threat of attacks. This is a war fought not only by soldiers, but by teams and emergency responders. Ukraine's use of long-range drones reflects a wider shift in warfare. Unmanned systems can be built and modified quickly, letting a country with limited air power strike distant targets without risking pilots. Russia has also leaned heavily on drones, using them in attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. The result is a contest where electronic warfare and air defenses matter as much as armor. Both sides are trying to outproduce and outadapt the others. Factories and the supply chains feeding them become strategic assets. Each strike and each interception becomes a lesson fed back into the next design at high speed. Diplomacy remains stalled. Proposals and contacts have surfaced, but the front lines and core political demands leave little room for compromise. In that environment, energy strikes serve multiple purposes. They impose costs, demonstrate reach, and reassure audiences that leaders are acting. They also send messages abroad. Ukraine wants support and tighter enforcement against Russian exports. Russia wants to show it can endure pressure and still punish Ukraine's infrastructure. The deeper this energy war runs, the harder rebuilding becomes. Yet energy is also one of the few arenas where a limited deal could reduce civilian suffering if talks gain traction soon. In the coming days, watch for a clearer damage picture. Will satellite imagery or news statements confirm disruptions at the Novoshakhtinsk refinery and the Orenburg gas plant? And for how long? Watch, too, for Russia's response. More strikes on Ukraine's grid or heavier air defenses around ports and refineries. Another indicator is fuel stress inside Russia, including any reports of shortages or price spikes. And keep an eye on diplomacy. Energy infrastructure is now both a bargaining chip and a humanitarian concern. If talks move at all, even limited steps to protect energy sites could reduce civilian harm during winter. For now, the latest claims reinforce a central truth. Energy is both currency and capability. Ukraine says it struck Russian oil and gas sites to cut revenues that fund the war and to complicate military logistics. Russia has confirmed a fire at Temryuk, while other details remain contested. Each side is turning infrastructure into leverage, and civilians live with the fallout outages, disruption, and fear of the next strike. As winter deepens, fuel and power will matter as much as any front line. This conflict will not be measured only in territory, but in which society can keep its lights on.